Rise of the European Emperor by Taishan Laonyo.
Chapter 691, Newcastle Situation. As a qualified merchant-type prince, Marin hates to see benefits. Especially, benefits like territory. Therefore, when Edward promised to give him another county, Marin agreed without a second thought, and then directly organized the army to go north. However, halfway through, Marin suddenly reacted, "Damn, I can't kill King James IV of Scotland casually. Otherwise, won't those German princes eat me? Killing the king casually will be hostile to all monarchs." So, Marin found Edward with a bitter face and said, "Your Majesty, don't cheat me. I am a law-abiding person and cannot kill the King of Scotland casually. If you can't kill their king, you can't annex Scotland. The county you promised, wouldn't that become an invalid promise?" Edward smiled awkwardly. He was also impulsive before. Thinking about it now, it seems a bit difficult. However, he quickly thought of a solution. "However, you can get another sinking ship. We will send James IV back to the country by sea and let him sink in the North Sea." Marin looked at Edward speechlessly. "Your Majesty, if you let your cousins sink into the sea once, everyone will think it was an accident. If you let James IV sink into the sea again, everyone in Europe will know that it was you who did it. This kind of skillful killing can be said to be an accident if used once, and it is done again, and it comes from the same person, even a fool will know what is going on." This. Edward was a little speechless. However, after thinking about it, Edward decided to destroy the Scottish army. Now, Newcastle has 8,000 defenders, plus the assistance of the bandit group. If Marin's 20,000 main forces suddenly arrive again, there is no reason why they cannot destroy the 10,000 Scottish troops. After destroying the 10,000 Scottish troops, there will be basically no Scottish men who can fight. After all, the total population of the Kingdom of Scotland is only 400,000 to 500,000. In the future, it will be easy for England to destroy Scotland. However, now is not the time to destroy Scotland. At least, we have to wait until we have control over the overall situation of England before we can destroy Scotland. Otherwise, if England is not stable, and we annex Scotland, we will die. But this opportunity is too rare, and Edward doesn't want to let it go. However, if Marin can't be given a Scottish county, he has to take a county from England to Marin. Otherwise, Marin, a businessman, will definitely not buy it. But if he gives the county of England, Edward will not be willing to give it up. If Marin is allowed to grow in England, what is the difference between being controlled by France? After thinking about it, Edward finally made up his mind. "Grand Duke Marin, the reward for a county remains unchanged. Since the territory of Scotland cannot be given to you, I will give you a county in Ireland as a reward." "Okay, deal. However, it must be a county suitable for agriculture in the east." Edward nodded and agreed to Marin's request. Edward didn't think much of the island of Ireland. For the Kingdom of England, the island of Ireland is more like a colony than a territory. Because the Irish are different from the English. As Marin said, the Irish are similar to the French Gauls and the Scots, all of whom are Celts, while the English are descendants of the Germanic people. Therefore, it is difficult for the Kingdom of England to control the island of Ireland, and rebellions there are also frequent. Therefore, giving a county to Marin is nothing. Marin doesn't care, as long as there is land. As for the national problem in Ireland, Marin thinks it is not a big problem. The reason for the problem is that it is not caused by their own people. The English rule the island of Ireland, but do not regard the Irish as human beings, but as inferiors. It would be strange if they did not rebel. Moreover, Marin believes that the national consciousness of Europeans in this era has not yet awakened. This thing was mainly awakened during the French Revolution, and it has long been the ability of the French Republic. Because fanatical nationalists are the craziest of all, and their madness is second only to fanatical believers. As long as the Irish live a good life, it is not difficult to integrate the Irish by combining soft means with the elimination of diehards. After unifying his thoughts, Marin no longer hesitated and led his army northward rapidly. And in Newcastle, on the north bank of the Tyne River, a fierce battle was taking place at this time. Scotland's 10,000 troops surrounded Newcastle and were attacking. The 3,300 thieves of the Robin Hood Thieves group who supported Newcastle did not arrive in Newcastle before the Scottish army. Because they were marching on foot. The southern part of the Pennines is several days away from Newcastle. Coster's confidant Lescott led 3,300 thieves to hurry up, but still lagged behind the Scottish army. In desperation, Lescott had to stay on the south bank of the Tyne with his men. It just so happened that England also needed to guard against the Scottish army crossing the Tyne and heading south. Moreover, there were more than 60,000 refugees camped on the south bank of the Tyne. Therefore, Lescott simply led his men to station on the south bank of the Tyne to guard against the Scottish army crossing the river. These 3,300 thieves all had hatred for the Scots. Therefore, they used their greatest enthusiasm to guard the Tyne River defense line and imitate the Scottish invaders to cross the river. As Lescott expected, the Scottish army did send people to cross the river. The reason for sending people across the river was that James IV coveted the tens of thousands of refugees on the south bank of the Tyne River. The Kingdom of Scotland was also short of population. Moreover, James IV was surprised to find that the refugees on the south bank of the Tyne actually had food to eat. Every day, smoke could be seen rising from the refugee camp on the south bank. So, James IV thought, send people across the river, capture people, and rob food at the same time. Looking at the amount of smoke on the south bank, it seems that there is a lot of food. Before, the Scottish army did not rob much food when passing through the northern part of Northumberland. After all, the production there has not been restored, and the food that can be robbed is limited. If the food of tens of thousands of refugees on the south bank can be robbed, even if the population cannot be robbed, it is still very cost-effective. However, the Scottish crossing operation was strongly resisted by the Robin Hood bandits. The thieves used several meter-long spears to stab the Scottish soldiers who were trying to board the south bank in small boats and rafts. Speaking of Scottish soldiers, their quality is definitely higher than that of the thieves of Robin Hood's band of thieves. If the knights were replaced, hundreds of knights would be able to defeat these thieves. But unfortunately, the Scottish army was crossing the river. Before the successful crossing of the river, the Scottish army could not form an effective formation at all, and the knights' horses were useless on the boat. Faced with the 3,300 thieves of Robin Hood's band of thieves waiting on the shore, the Scots were helpless. Fortunately, the Scottish army was not short of food, and it was said that there were more food reserves in Newcastle. Therefore, James IV, who led the army personally, simply stopped the plan to cross the south and concentrated on attacking Newcastle. Anyway, those thieves on the south bank who were similar to militias would never dare to cross the river. Otherwise, the Scottish knights would definitely let them know what iron hoof trampling meant. Although there were few Scottish knights, there were also hundreds of them. They wore plate armor provided by the French, and their martial arts were taught by French knights. Their fighting power was not bad, but their numbers were a little small. In this way, a delicate balance was formed near Newcastle. The Scottish army could not cross the river to the south, but the 3,300 thieves of the Robin Hood Thieves group did not dare to cross the river to support Newcastle. And the other two groups of the Robin Hood Thieves group, after seeing that the Scottish army had arrived at the north bank of Tyne, went directly west, intending to bypass the upper reaches of the Tyne from the mountainous area, go around to the rear of the Scottish army, and launch an attack. Chapter 692, Maneuvering at Sea, Going Behind Enemy Lines. A few days later, Marin's army also approached the south bank of the Tyne. But the scouts in front also brought back bad news: the army might not be able to cross the Tyne smoothly. Although Marin's troops were twice as many as the Scottish army was on the north bank of the Tyne. If they defended the north bank of the Tyne with all their strength, Marin's army would suffer heavy casualties if they tried to force a crossing. After thinking about it, Marin ordered the army to stop advancing before the army arrived at the south bank of the Tyne. Grand Duke Marin, why did you stop the army? Edward asked. Your Majesty, although we have a lot of people, it is difficult to cross the Tyne. The Scottish army is on the north bank of the Tyne and will definitely not allow us to cross the river smoothly. Then, what should we do? Edward really didn't understand military affairs. Let me think. Then, Marin found the map of Newcastle that his men had mapped. After half a day, Marin finally found a way. Send a signalman to return to Grimsby port as fast as possible and ask them to mobilize dozens of transport ships. What do you mean? Edward was puzzled. Marin pointed to the map and explained. Your Majesty, our army is here now, about half a day's journey from the Tyne River. Near our station, there is a small fishing village called Sunderland. Later generations, this place is a city, and there is also a Premier League team. Of course, it is the kind of elevator. I plan to send a fleet to transport the army. Transport the army to a small fishing village called Ashington in the north. The small fishing village is more than 10 miles, about 30 kilometers, north of Newcastle. After our army lands, it can reach the outskirts of Newcastle within a day, and suddenly appear in the north of the Scottish army, catching them off guard. Well, it's really a good idea. You are really a military genius. Edward had to agree with Marin's plan. The key is that he couldn't think of any good plan. However, it would take several days for Grimsby's ship to come to transport people. So, Marin first brought the army to the small fishing village of Sunderland. Because the small fishing village only has a long bridge pier for the small fishing boats in the village to dock, Marin had to send troops to build a temporary pier. Thinking that the small fishing village called Ashington might be the same, Marin suddenly had a headache. In this way, it is estimated that it will take 2 weeks to complete the flanking operation. During this time, Marin also hopes to cause some trouble to the Scots. So Marin sent a messenger to the south bank of the Tyne River on horseback to inform Lescott to select thousands of young and strong men from the refugee camp on the river bank, cut down trees to make simple wooden sticks and spears, and train by the river every day to scare the Scots. The Scots will definitely be nervous when they see thousands of new recruits training on the south bank. Together with the previous 3,300 thieves, the total number has exceeded 10,000. It would be strange if the Scottish army didn't get nervous. In fact, Marin just let these people bluff, and he wouldn't really let them cross the river to fight. Just a group of farmers, if they really crossed the river to fight, they would definitely give the Scottish army heads. However, their bluffing behavior can greatly attract the attention of the Scottish army, making the Scots have no time to look north and ignore Marin's army. At the same time, in order to keep the secrets and prevent the Scots from noticing the traces of Marin's army, Marin also made changes to the arrangements for Coster and Merrick's troops. He sent people to the west along the south bank of the Tyne River to find Coster and Merrick's troops. For the 900 horse thieves led by Coster, the tasks arranged by Marin changed. These horse thieves no longer attacked the Scottish food route, but protected the news near Ashington from being leaked. Once Scottish scouts approached here, these 900 horse thieves were responsible for intercepting and killing them to prevent the news from being leaked and protecting the news of Marin's army landing from being leaked. As for the 3,000 thieves led by Merrick, Marin no longer asked them to attack the Scottish camp at night. Because this matter was taken over by Marin's main force. Their task was changed to capture the Scottish civilians who fled when Marin's main force attacked the enemy camp. Scotland's 10,000 troops brought 7,000 civilians with them. According to the spies' report, their station was not in the same camp as the Scottish soldiers, but was stationed separately. When Marin's army attacked the Scottish soldiers' camp, they were worried that these Scottish militiamen would run around. Therefore, it would be best to let Merrick take 3,000 thieves to control those Scottish militiamen. Moreover, they are also capable of doing it. A few days later, Grimsby Port really sent dozens of transport ships over. According to Marin's request, the ships that came were not big. As for the 500-ton warships, they were all left in Grimsby. Because both Sunderland and Ashington are small fishing villages by the sea, and there is no good port nearby. If a ship is too big, Marin is afraid of running aground. After the arrival of these ships, Marin did not let the soldiers board the ship immediately, but took a ship first and loaded 200 soldiers first. These soldiers are good at water and can skillfully build the long bridge pier. Marin selected them to let them arrive at Ashington in advance to build a long bridge pier suitable for the fleet to dock. Otherwise, dozens of big ships of 100 or 200 tons suddenly poured into a small fishing village like Ashington, and they would definitely not be able to dock. After these 200 soldiers who were good at building temporary long bridge docks boarded the ship with tools and headed north, Marin did not immediately let other soldiers board the ship, but waited a few days. After all, after those soldiers arrived at Ashington, they needed to cut wood and then build a temporary long bridge dock, which would take a few days to complete. Moreover, this was under the condition of conscripting local labor to help. If these 200 people did it alone, it would probably take more than a month to get it done. In the next few days, Marin led the army to build the long bridge dock in Sunderland while training the soldiers. Among them, there was also training for waiting landing. Now is July and August, the hottest time of the year. Therefore, waiting landing is nothing, but it will feel comfortable. Of course, it is better for real landlubbers not to play like this. The 2 legions in Marin's hands are the first legion composed of pure Germans. Most of the soldiers are from the Württemberg Mountains and Alsace, and most of them are landlubbers. Therefore, Marin planned to let all these people land formally through the Long Bridge Wharf. As for the 4th Legion of Sakara, it was composed of Frisian officers and English soldiers. Whether it was the Frisians or the English, they were all seafaring nations, and most of the soldiers were familiar with water. Therefore, Marin decided that in the case of insufficient Long Bridge Wharf, these soldiers who were familiar with water would wade and land in Ashington to speed up the landing rhythm. A week later, Marin estimated that Ashington was almost done, and Grimsby had dozens of ships from the mainland of the Grand Duchy of the North Sea. Among them, there were several 250-class armed merchant ships. After all, it was an army of 20,000, and there were no more than 100 ships, which could not be transported at once. Marin led the army and began to board the ship to Ashington. In order to speed up efficiency, Marin did not bring the civilians who transported food, nor did he bring most of the baggage on board this time. He just asked the soldiers to bring 10 days of rations and set off with them on board. Anyway, after defeating the Scottish army, there will be no shortage of food when entering Newcastle. Moreover, after defeating the Scottish army, Marin's army still had to go back south to London. Therefore, Marin simply asked the civilians to take the baggage and food and wait in Sunderland, waiting for the army to return and join them. With trepidation and excitement, Edward also boarded the ship and carried out a sea maneuver with the army, bypassing the enemy and launching a fatal attack. Chapter 693, The Quick March South. As Marin expected, the small fishing village of Ashington did not have very good landing conditions. After arriving at Ashington, the 200 soldiers wanted to recruit local labor to build a temporary Long Bridge pier. However, the local population was really scarce, and in the end only more than 400 able-bodied men were captured. More than 600 people worked hard for several days, and when Marin's fleet arrived, only 10 temporary Long Bridge piers were built. Including the 2 Long Bridge piers of quality, it is estimated that it will take 3 days to complete the landing of the army with this amount of unloading. Fortunately, Marin had a plan in advance. With an order, the Frisian and English soldiers, who were familiar with water, jumped off the boats and waded or swam to land when the boats approached the land. As for the German landlubbers of the First Army, they waited obediently on the sea, with ships queuing up at the docks, waiting for servants. After more than a day of work, 20,000 troops and hundreds of horses completed the landing. This time, in pursuit of efficiency, Marin did not bring any baggage or artillery, but only a few gunpowder barrels to blow up the walls of the enemy camp. In addition, Marin also brought 500 horses used by reconnaissance cavalry. Marin attached great importance to tactical reconnaissance, so reconnaissance cavalry carrying telescopes has always been the standard in Marin's army. These reconnaissance cavalry are basically equipped with telescopes, sabers and clockwork flintlocks. In a sense, their fighting style is very similar to that of the Black Shirt Knights. However, they did not wear the black armor special for the Black Shirt Knights, and the number of clockwork flintlock carbines they carried was only 2 or 3, which was less than that of the Black Shirt Knights. In addition to the task of scouting the enemy, these people also had to play the important task of intercepting messengers. Therefore, Marin equipped them with clockwork ignition carbines to facilitate their interception and pursuit of those messengers. Just riding and chasing may not be able to keep the opponent's messenger. Therefore, Marin equipped them with clockwork muskets to facilitate their shooting of the enemy's messengers. Moreover, in order to ensure the success of the interception, Marin scouts have a very important principle when intercepting the opponent's horse-riding messenger: give priority to aiming at the opponent's horse. Because an excellent rider may make difficult movements on horseback. However, the horse will not. Moreover, the target of the horse is much larger than the rider himself. Shooting a horse with a smoothbore gun has a much higher success rate than shooting a rider. As long as the opponent's horse is shot, the opponent's messenger will definitely fall down. At that time, it is a matter of how to deal with the scouts who are intercepted and killed at random. When landing, 500 scout cavalry took the lead in landing with their war horses, and even Marin was behind them in the order of landing. After landing, these scout cavalry immediately spread out and connected with the 900 horse bandits led by Coster, and began to work together to block the news of the army's landing. But early the next morning, when Marin was still asleep, the scout cavalry leader Mackensen hurriedly asked to see Marin, claiming that it was urgent. Marin got up reluctantly and accepted Mackensen's report. Grand Duke, according to Coster's intelligence, in the past few days, the cavalry of Robin Hood thieves has intercepted and killed Scottish messengers near Ashington on the seaside. However, this coastal road is one of the important roads for the Scots to contact their homeland. Being intercepted and killed for several days in a row has aroused the suspicion of the Scots. How do you know? Marin asked doubtfully. The Scots are suspicious, and you can also detect it. The level is too high. It's like this. My scouts have discovered that the other side has sent hundreds of cavalry from the camp early in the morning to search along the coast. It seems that they are also suspicious about the missing messengers. It is certain that they will find something. Just kill them. Marin said indifferently while chewing bread. Grand Duke, this time is different. These hundreds of people are different from the previous messengers. They are sent by the Scots to investigate. Even if we kill them, they can't go back to the camp, and the Scots will definitely be suspicious. Because this is an investigation team sent by the Scottish camp. One less person will cause a larger scale investigation and the vigilance of the Scots. Marin was no longer angry at getting up, and his mind was clear. He knew that Mackensen was right. Since the Scots have taken it seriously, even if he sent people to kill these people, as long as these people did not return to the camp, the Scots would find something wrong. Once such a thing is discovered, the Scots will definitely take strict precautions. It would be difficult to launch a sneak attack again. After thinking about it, Marin decisively threw away the bread in his hand and shouted. Order! Mackensen and the guards around him all stood straight, standing at attention with serious faces. Order! Mackensen cooperates with Coster's cavalry to intercept and kill this group of Scottish investigation teams. No one must be let back. Yes. Mackensen responded loudly and accepted Marin's order. Also, notify General Schwartz and ask him to reorganize his troops and lead the army south after breakfast. Since the Scots have already noticed something, we will march south quickly and attack the enemy camp directly to catch them off guard. Yes. The guard in charge of the message quickly left Marin's temporary residence and conveyed the notice to Schwartz. After a while, Marin saw that the soldiers in the camp had already eaten breakfast but were still dismantling the tents, and he was immediately angry. Don't dismantle them, just go south. After defeating the Scots, we will go directly to Newcastle City to rest. As for the tents, leave 200 people here to dismantle them. The rest of you, pack up and hurry south. After being scolded by Marin, everyone stopped dismantling the tents, and instead carried their food bags, held their weapons, and quickly lined up. After a long trumpet sound, Marin's 20,000 troops marched in neat queues along the road to Newcastle City, 30 kilometers away. And those who reacted faster than these infantrymen were the reconnaissance cavalry. After receiving Marin's instructions, Mackensen quickly gathered all the scouts, all mounted their horses and went south. Even those who had just returned from their shifts were taken south together. Marin asked to eliminate the Scottish cavalry, but there were more than 300 cavalry. In order to ensure the encirclement and annihilation of this enemy army, Mackensen had to gather everyone to prevent failure. It was not that he was afraid of not being able to defeat the Irish cavalry, because with the cooperation of 900 horse thieves, Mackensen's reconnaissance cavalry regiment could not fail to defeat the enemy. What Mackensen was worried about was that someone in the enemy army would escape. As long as one person escaped and reported back to the Scottish camp, then Marin's sneak attack would become a joke. The enemy army was already prepared, so what was the point of a sneak attack? Edward had no choice but to follow the army southward. On the way, Edward complained. I say, Grand Duke Marin, your troops are superior to the Scots, and you can beat them easily. Now you are attacking from the back and cutting off their retreat. Why do you want to launch a sneak attack? Are you addicted to sneak attacks? Why don't you kill the enemy openly? Marin looked at Edward speechlessly, and after a while he said. The sneak attack is of course to reduce casualties. If the Scottish army is prepared, the enemy may fight desperately when their retreat is cut off. Facing the enemy fighting desperately, we will definitely suffer a lot of casualties. I do this to protect the lives of the soldiers. But this will damage your noble honor. Edward said puzzledly. Compared with the noble honor, I care more about the safety of my soldiers. And this is also an important guarantee for me to win the battle. Marin said loudly. After speaking, Marin winked at the guards around him. Marin said this on purpose. Sure enough, after hearing Marin say this, the soldiers around him were very moved, a monarch who values the lives of soldiers more than the honor of nobles is so worthy of following. When they stopped for lunch, under the deliberate promotion of Marin's confidants, the conversation between Marin and Edward quickly spread. Many soldiers who were born as serfs were deeply moved, and some even cried, "Such a person who cares about the lives of soldiers more than his own noble honor, isn't it worth dying for?" For a time, morale was greatly boosted. "Oh my God, it snowed heavily today, and the bus was crawling on the road and came back very late at night. This winter is very unusual, with 2 consecutive blizzards, which is rare in history." Chapter 694. The night raid begins. After lunch, Marin found that the eyes of the soldiers around him were full of respect and gratitude. Moreover, everyone's morale was high, as if they were blessed with the aura of war. "Well, the army can be used." Marin nodded with satisfaction. No matter what era of war, as long as the equipment level of both sides is not particularly different, then morale is a very important part of it. The side with high morale, even if it is at a disadvantage, is very likely to defeat the stronger side. On the contrary, if the army is weak, it may also be defeated by a weak enemy. Seeing that his little trick made the morale high, Marin was very happy. Moreover, this also made it more likely to win. At about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the army had arrived at a forest 5 kilometers north of Newcastle. After arriving here, Marin ordered the army to stop and rest on the spot north of the woods. "It is very close to the Scottish army here. If you go further, you will be discovered." Before it got dark, Marin took everyone to sit down and rest on the spot. Because it was going to be a night attack, it was best to get some sleep in advance. After eating dry bread, Marin asked everyone to rest for a few hours. However, those tents were not brought over, so everyone had no place to sleep. In desperation, Marin had to let the soldiers sit back to back on the ground to rest. Wait until midnight to get up and attack. However, without the shelter of the tent, the mosquitoes in summer seemed particularly annoying. It was the beginning of August, the hottest time of summer. Although Scotland is at a high latitude, there are also many mosquitoes in summer. So everyone was suffering. Marin was a little ashamed at this time, because he did not let everyone bring tents, which led to the current bad situation. So, regardless of his men's dissuasion, he came to the middle of the soldiers, and sat on the ground with Con, who had been following him, back to back, to rest. Of course, he was also attacked by mosquitoes. In the middle of the night, Marin was sleeping in a daze, and suddenly there was a sharp pain on his face. So, he waved his hand without thinking. Snap, the sound was particularly loud in the silent night. Con, who was originally back to back with Marin, woke up immediately. He stood up suddenly, scanning around with his eyes. "Is there an assassin?" This made Marin suffer. He and Con were originally resting back to back. As a result, Con stood up suddenly, and Marin was decisively tragic. His back was empty, and the whole person fell to the ground, and the back of his head came into close contact with the ground. Ouch! Marin touched the back of his head, which was a little painful. Fortunately, this is a mud floor, not a concrete floor or a brick floor. Otherwise, such a bump would have caused blood. "Ah, master, I'm sorry, I forgot you were behind me." Con was embarrassed immediately. He forgot that he and Marin were resting back to back. Marin was too lazy to blame him. He looked at the pocket watch that was almost as big as an alarm clock in the moonlight. It was exactly 12 o'clock in the middle of the night. So, he simply didn't sleep. Anyway, after defeating the Scottish army, everyone can enter Newcastle City and sleep as much as they want. Marin simply asked Con to find the scout cavalry and ask them to contact the 3,000 thieves brought by Merrick and inform them to prepare for joint operations. However, Marin made adjustments to Merrick's actions. Originally, Merrick's mission was to take 3,000 thieves to attack the Scottish militia camp separated from the battle camp when the main force attacked the enemy's battle camp. However, Marin later felt that those militias did not need to attack them. Anyway, they had no combat power. So it would be better to encircle them instead. As long as the exit of the militia camp was blocked, those militias would not have the courage to rush out. In this way, 3,000 people would not be needed. For this reason, Marin planned to let Merrick send 2,000 people to encircle the militia camp. The other 1,000 people set up an ambush on the road to the north of Newcastle at night, set up some tripwires and so on, and specifically intercept the fish that slipped through the net of the Scottish army. After all, this time Marin launched a real night raid, and it was inevitable that some fish would slip through the net and escape in the chaos. And those who could escape must be on horseback. But in the dark, they would not dare to take the small road when they escaped, and would choose to gallop on the main road. As far as Marin knew, there was only one Roman road to the north of Newcastle. Therefore, Marin asked Merrick to arrange 1,000 people to set up several tripwires on this road to the north to intercept the Scottish soldiers who were escaping from Luwan. You know, those who are qualified to ride horses are all nobles and big fish. And Marin was too lazy to intercept the infantry who didn't even have horses. Moreover, those who escaped on foot would be caught up by the scout cavalry sooner or later, which was irrelevant. Merrick's 3,000 thieves were actually in a forest 4 kilometers west of Marin's position at this time. The scout cavalry under Marin had contacted them before. So this time the communication was very fast. After the scout cavalry came back, Marin simply asked his men to wake up all the soldiers and start preparing for the night attack. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, the 20,000 soldiers under Marin's command were all ready and lined up, ready to set off at any time. Marin led the army forward for another 2 kilometers and ordered everyone to stop. Then, Marin asked the demolition team to go forward and bury gunpowder barrels beside the fence of the Scottish military camp. Around 3:30 in the morning, the demolition team in front sent a message: 3 of the 5 gunpowder barrels were in place. What's going on? Why are there only 3 buried? Marin frowned and asked the demolition team leader Doni Tsrui, who came back to report. Doni, Tsrui said with a depressed face. Grand Duke, it's not that we didn't try our best, but the defense of the Scottish camp seems to be very strict tonight. We tried every possible way to find 3 hidden locations to bury gunpowder barrels. We wanted to find the 4th point, but we couldn't find it. The other side is on guard. Marin frowned, but soon realized that his scout cavalry and Coster's 900 horse bandits had eaten more than 300 Scottish scout cavalry. It would be strange if the other side was indifferent. In fact, it was just as Marin expected. Seeing that the more than 300 scout cavalry sent out during the day did not come back at night, James IV was full of uneasiness. Although sometimes the scout cavalry went out for several days, there was no reason not to send someone back to report. For this reason, the uneasy James IV ordered to be vigilant at night. And this also brought a lot of trouble to Doni Tsrui's demolition team. After much effort, the demolition team found 3 blind spots in the camp and began to bury gunpowder barrels. Marin began to hesitate about whether to give up the night attack because the opponent might be prepared. However, Marin quickly reacted: I have 20,000 people, I can win even if I fight normally, let alone a night attack. So, the original plan continued. In fact, although James IV took precautions, the level of defense was not high. Because James IV would not have thought that there would be a large army in the north to attack them. Therefore, the Scottish army's midnight alert was more aimed at the direction of Newcastle City and the south bank of the Tyne River. Because, in James IV's cognition, there would only be large enemy armies in these 2 directions. As for the accident of the messenger in the north, James IV thought that it was a small team sent by the enemy to harass, and it would not have much impact on the camp. Then, this judgment harmed the whole of Scotland. Of course, it's not his fault. Who would have thought that someone would lead a large army to maneuver at sea and get behind the Scottish army? In the eyes of James IV, Marin's army should have already gone south to London. A little after 4 o'clock, Marin's army finally approached the Scottish camp. At this time, the east was already slightly white. After all, it was summer and the sun rose early. Seeing that the time was almost up, Marin no longer hesitated. He asked someone to light the torch and shook it. The blaster in front of the camp immediately took out the valuable lit matchlock covered with cloth and lit the fuse. Then, the 3 blasters who had set the blaster on fire ran back desperately. Soon, 3 loud noises of boom 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 dash erupted from the camp on the north side of the Scottish camp, and the wooden fence of the Scottish camp was blown up to the sky. 500 meters away, Marin drew his knight's sword and shouted. Attack! Charge! The 20,000 troops who had been ready for battle rushed to the Scottish camp like a tide and rushed in through 3 gaps. Sorry, I came back late last night and it was too cold, so I missed a chapter. Let's see if I can make up for it today. If not, I'll make up for it tomorrow, which is Saturday. Chapter 695, The Capture of James IV. Boom boom boom, three loud noises were heard, and the Scottish King James IV, who was originally sleeping, was suddenly awakened. "What's going on, Ferguson? Go out and take a look." In the big tent, the night guard Ferguson was immediately ordered to go out to check. After a while, Ferguson ran back in a panic. "Your Majesty, something big has happened, someone attacked the camp." "What? Someone attacked the camp? How many people are there on the other side? Quickly organize the soldiers to resist and drive the enemy out of the camp." The Scottish army was prepared, because none of the scouts sent out during the day came back, and James IV had ordered everyone to be alert in the middle of the night. Therefore, after the night attack began, many Scottish soldiers still put on their clothes and walked out of the big tent with weapons. Of course, some Scottish soldiers began to run around like headless flies because of fear and terror. So, at the beginning, those more alert Scottish soldiers were busy suppressing and appeasing those comrades who bombed the camp, and they didn't have time to gather together to form a battle formation. This delay doomed the Scottish army to misery. Because, under the leadership of 3,000 sword and shield soldiers, Marin's army rushed directly into the Scottish camp and divided and surrounded the Scottish army into several pieces. Influenced by the last time he was shot by bows and arrows, Marin did not enter the enemy camp himself this time. Moreover, Edward was by his side, and he could not let Edward, the king, take risks. So, he and Edward stayed outside the camp under the protection of the guards. However, Conn, the Beast, was still put in as a pioneer. With him charging in front, no one could stop him. Moreover, the Scottish army was a cold weapon unit. In addition to artillery, the Scottish army was not equipped with muskets. It was impossible to use artillery in the rush of the night attack. Let Conn charge, there was no danger. Under Conn's leadership, the Scottish troops retreated one after another and could not gather in the middle of the camp. James IV looked at the situation around him, his heart full of despair. "Your Majesty, please run away." The captain of the guard, Knight Ferguson, said anxiously. "Run away? How to run? Didn't you see so many people on the other side?" James IV said in despair. "No, Your Majesty, I found that the other side has few troops in the east." Knight Ferguson suddenly said. Indeed, the three blasting points that Marin sent people to open were all in the north and west directions. Because James IV had asked the Scottish soldiers on night watch to pay more attention to the city of Newcastle to the east of the camp and the militia in the south of the camp. Therefore, the defenses on the north and west were relatively weak, which allowed the blasting team to find 3 gunpowder barrel burial sites. However, because the east side was more tightly guarded, there was naturally no blasting point here. Without a blasting point, there would be no gap. Without a gap, there would be no enemy soldiers. Seeing that it was irreversible, James IV finally made up his mind to flee with his trusted men. It just so happened that James IV had too few Scottish cavalry this time, so he simply put all the horses near the general's tent. So when James IV and his hundreds of Scottish knights came to the stables near the general's tent, they easily got the horses. Then, James IV took his hundreds of trusted knights, rode on war horses, and rode towards the east gate of the camp. Because they were escaping, everyone was very impatient. Facing the Scottish fleeing soldiers blocking the way, the knights crushed them mercilessly. After arriving at the east gate, the knights struggled to open the logs that supported the east gate and opened the camp. Then, James IV took hundreds of trusted knights and left the camp directly from the east gate. After leaving the camp, James IV took his men without hesitation and went directly north. There was their hometown of Scotland. At this time, it was already 4:30 in the morning. 4:30 in the morning in early August was already quite bright. James IV galloped north with hundreds of knights. Halfway through, the thousands of infantrymen that Marin arranged to guard here were directly dispersed by hundreds of knights of James IV. Of course, hundreds of Scottish knights were picked off their horses by spearmen. But James IV had no time to rescue these men, because he knew that if he delayed for a while, he would not be able to get away. So, James IV and his remaining 200 men continued to gallop north without hesitation. Marin also saw James IV's gang fleeing north to the north of the camp. Marin hurriedly sent guards to notify the scout cavalry and costers 900 horse thieves to chase them with all their strength. Because Marin could feel that there were big fish among those hundreds of people. Marin was not worried that the scout cavalry would not catch up with the enemy, because his 500 scout cavalry were equipped with Arabian horses, which were one of the most durable breeds. The Scottish horses were typical knights with large size, great strength, strong explosive power, but poor endurance. Moreover, because of the hasty escape, the group of Scottish people who escaped on horseback did not have 2 horses, but 1 person and 1 horse. Without changing horses, Marin did not believe that their horses could outrun his Arabian horses. Then, he continued to focus on the battle in the camp. At the same time, the 2,000 thieves under Merrick also surrounded several exits of the Scottish militia camp, but did not launch an attack, but waited for the results from the camp. In the camp, the Scottish resistance was getting weaker and weaker. After all, they resisted hastily, and they were divided and surrounded before they could form a larger battle formation. In addition, Marin had twice as many men and horses as them. Under the division, encirclement and strong impact of the superior enemy, their resistance was getting weaker and weaker. Conn was extremely brave. He wielded a huge mace, wearing plate armor all over his body, and his breastplate was made of high manganese steel. It was invulnerable to swords and guns, and the power of the weapon was very huge. Such a war machine was naturally like entering a no-man's land, and quickly defeated all the enemies in front of it. However, when Conn rushed into the Central Army tent with hundreds of sword and shield soldiers, he was surprised to find that the Central Army tent was empty. Fuck. It turns out that James IV was among the hundreds of people who escaped. Damn it, all the horsemen, chase them. But Marin soon found that this order was in vain, because, in the entire army, there were only 500 cavalrymen on horseback. Although he also rode a horse, he couldn't chase them by himself, right? As for the guards, Marin didn't let them chase them in the end. As Marin expected, James IV and his men were soon caught up by the scout cavalry riding Arabian horses. Seeing that the enemy was getting closer and closer, the captain of the guards Ferguson gritted his teeth and said, "Your Majesty, you take a few people to go first, and we will stop these enemies." Then, Ferguson turned his horse's head with 200 Scottish knights and rushed towards the chasing scout cavalry. James IV continued to flee northward with a dozen guards. Seeing 200 Scottish knights turning around and rushing over, Marin's scout cavalry were shocked. In terms of close combat on horseback, they were no match for these knights. So, these scout cavalry decisively turned their horses around and started to fight with the enemy, never engaging head-on. At the same time, they took out their spring-loaded ignition carbines that had been loaded with ammunition. As for James IV, just as he was madly fleeing northward with his men, several long hemp ropes suddenly rose up on the road ahead. At the same time, a group of people stood up in the ditch on the side of the road. James IV and his men were galloping on their horses at this time. Seeing this, although they shouted in their hearts that it was not good, they could not control their horses to stop. So, including James IV, the horses of this group of people were tripped by the trip rope. James IV and the guards on horseback could not stop and fell down directly. Then, they were knocked unconscious, and before they could recover, they were held down by a group of thieves from the Robin Hood thieves group, and then tied up. When 500 scout cavalry finally solved the 200 Scottish knights who blocked the road with spring-ignited carbines and rushed north, they saw Merrick leading 1,000 men, pushing and shoving south. Merrick personally led people to ambush on the roadside this time. As for the encirclement of the militia camp, because there was no need to fight, he only sent a deputy to lead people. As for the ambush on the roadside, he decided to lead people to do it himself. Because he was the only one familiar with the fighting method of using a tripwire. After all, he had worked under Marin and knew how to use a tripwire. But he didn't expect that this time he personally led the ambush and actually caught a super big fish. Seeing the scout cavalry coming up, Merrick smiled at Mackensen, the leader he was familiar with. "Knight Mackensen, I have done a great deed this time. See. This is the King of Scotland." Chapter 696 Blackmail first, then kill. The 200 Scottish plate-armored knights lost unfairly. In the past, facing the light cavalry, the plate-armored knights armed to the teeth would easily defeat the opponent. At the very least, they had to scare the opponent away. However, unexpectedly, this time, they kicked on the iron plate, the clockwork ignition carbine, which was specially used to fight the plate-armored knights. The scout cavalry riding on Arabian horses first rode their horses and retreated a long distance under the pursuit of the Scottish plate-armored knights. Then, the Scottish knights' horses ran out of strength. Originally, the Scottish knights were fully armed and riding their horses to escape, which consumed a lot of the horses' physical strength. Now, they turned around and chased for a while, and they couldn't run anymore. If they didn't rest for 10 to 20 minutes, they couldn't run again. Taking this opportunity, Mackensen commanded 500 scout cavalry to slowly approach, raised the clockwork ignition carbine, and aimed at the Scottish knights. With a chaotic burst of gunfire, the Scottish knights were knocked off their horses one after another. Although few were killed directly, most of them were injured and could not get up for a while. Mackensen was worried, so he asked his men to load all the clockwork flintlocks, and then approached carefully with the guns raised. There were indeed rebels. Some Scottish knights who were not injured waved their swords and wanted to see what the scout cavalry were doing, but they were knocked to the ground by the volley guns, and countless bones were broken. Then, 200 Scottish knights with high martial arts skills were captured so aggrievedly. Except for a few who were killed, most of the Scottish knights were captured by injuries. Later, Mackensen thought of the suspected big fish that had escaped, and hurriedly took most of the people to continue chasing north, leaving some people to escort the injured Scottish knights back to the camp. However, halfway, Mackensen was surprised to find that Merrick was coming south with a group of thieves and a dozen people in plate armor who were tied up. Those people seemed to be the big fish who escaped under the cover of those Scottish knights. What made Mackensen extremely jealous was that this big fish was actually the King of Scotland. You know, even though Marin was the Lord, his greatest achievement was to ambush and defeat the knights of Charles VIII, but he still let Charles VIII escape. Capturing a king alive like Merrick is simply a rare achievement. You bastard, you're rich this time. Capturing the King of Scotland alive can at least get you a baron. Mackensen said with red eyes. For a moment, Mackensen even wanted to kill Merrick's people and take the credit for himself. In the end, he suppressed this greed. Anyway, he defeated 200 Scottish knights, and his merits were enough to be promoted to a hereditary knight. Before, Mackensen was just an ordinary knight. He was a confidant of Saul. After Saul was promoted, he became a minister, so he naturally didn't have to lead the reconnaissance team himself. So, Mackensen, who was more capable, was promoted to take over his command of the reconnaissance cavalry regiment. When Mackensen's men escorted a group of Scottish knights back to the Scottish camp, the battle in the Scottish camp was not over yet. Because the Scots had been prepared for a long time, some people were dressed and carried weapons before going to bed at night. They formed small formations and resisted for a long time, causing more than 1,000 casualties to Marin's army. This was a record-breaking night attack by Marin. But fortunately, Marin's men had a high armor rate. Even ordinary soldiers wore wooden armor with iron sheets attached, which had good protection. Therefore, even if there were more than 1,000 casualties, most of them were injured. With the treatment of alcohol, gold wound medicine and gauze, most people can still be saved. The number of real deaths was no more than 100. Looking at the 200 Scottish knights who were carried back, Marin suddenly realized. So he waved his hand and called for military doctors. These military doctors were disciples of Morigen and Bader, familiar with Mongolian medicine, and best at bone setting and contusions. Therefore, it would be right to hand over these Scottish knights with broken bones to them. After all, these knights are all people with a certain amount of wealth, and the ransom can reach hundreds of gold coins each. As expensive hostages, Marin has the obligation to ensure that they do not die. When Merrick brought King James IV of Scotland back, Marin opened his mouth in surprise. Damn, this time he caught a king, it's really a big deal. Although the Scottish soldiers were well prepared and resisted stubbornly. However, facing twice as many powerful enemies and being divided and surrounded early, they could not avoid the fate of failure no matter how brave they were. Not long after James IV was brought back, the entire Scottish camp fell. Marin and Edward, with James IV tied up, entered the central army tent that originally belonged to James IV. At this time, James IV also knew the identities of Edward and Marin. So, after entering the big tent, he roared. "Edward, what do you mean? Why do you attack me instead of attacking your great enemy Henry VII? We are in the same camp. You will be despised by all nobles for attacking your allies like this." James IV decided to take the initiative and refute Edward from the righteousness, so that the other party would let him go. Edward was well prepared. He replied calmly. "Your Majesty James, I remember that I did not invite you and your army to enter England, right? Your march this time is an invasion of England. As the King of England, I have the obligation to stop your invasion. I am here to help you, how can you deal with me? In order to get out of the situation, James IV began to quibble. Help me? Huh, didn't you see the white rose flag on the top of Newcastle? That is the symbol of my York family. The white rose battle flag is hung on the top of Newcastle, indicating that this is my territory. You still insist on attacking, is it the way of an ally? Edward responded with a sneer. Suddenly, James IV was at a loss for words. Yes, Newcastle's guard commander Sivag stated his identity at the beginning, we are His Majesty Edward's men. As a result, the Scottish army ignored them and continued to attack, which was indeed not what an ally should do. After settling James IV down, Edward began to discuss with Marin how to deal with James IV. Edward now feels very tricky. If James IV died on the battlefield, it would be easy to say. Now that the other party has been captured alive, he can't do anything to him. And the shipwreck murder method planned before, as Marin said, can be done once but not twice. Murdering his cousins, everyone can only criticize it. Murdering the king of a country will be isolated and hostile to the whole of Europe. Even if you want to kill, you have to do it cleanly, and you must clear yourself. Grand Duke Marin, what do you say, how should I deal with this James IV? Exchange for money. King, it's worth a lot of ransom. Marin's eyes were suddenly full of gold coins. Exchange for money? Edward was immediately full of black lines, I want the territory of Scotland, not money. So, he suppressed his anger and said. I want Scotland, not money. Marin shook his head and said. Excuse me, Your Majesty, before England stabilizes, it is not advisable to annex the Kingdom of Scotland. Otherwise, you will have more headaches. Edward nodded. He also knew that before England stabilized, it was not advisable to annex Scotland, otherwise it would be easy to die. However, he was unwilling. If we miss this opportunity, it will be difficult for us to catch James IV next time. Indeed, it is easy to capture a wild king in the wild, but it seems too difficult to capture the king of another country by attacking the capital. In fact, before this, the Holy Roman Emperor was able to capture the King of England because Richard I was in a hurry to return to his country to quell the rebellion and pass through Vienna disguised as a merchant. He did not have many troops around him, so he was easily captured. Marin suddenly turned his head and smiled slightly, saying, Why do you want to let him go? Edward was stunned and said, Do you mean to imprison him like this? Marin shook his head and said, That would be a waste. We can imprison him while asking for a huge ransom from Scotland. You know, a king must be worth at least 1 million gold coins. 1 million gold coins. Edward was a little dizzy. He had never seen so much money. According to the current exchange rate, £1 is equal to 4 gold coins, which is equivalent to £250,000. Of course, this pound is impure. Because of the reduction in currency purity, £1 is now only equivalent to about 170 grams of pure silver, equivalent to 4 gold coins, not as valuable as in the early years. Of course, when Richard I was captured by Emperor Henry VI, didn't he also ask for 150,000 marks, equivalent to £100,000, of pure silver? At that time, silver was not adulterated, and the purity was guaranteed. Of course, £1 of silver does not refer to 453.59 grams of silver, but the Troy pound system, which is only 373.242 grams, equivalent to 12 ounces. And because the silver coin is not pure silver is too soft to be minted, and the silver dollar is mixed with copper to ensure hardness, so £1 at that time was equivalent to about 350 grams of pure silver, much better than the current 170 grams per pound. Marin asked for 1 million gold coins, equivalent to £250,000, which is more than 20% more expensive than Richard I's ransom. But considering the price increase over the past few hundred years, it is not more expensive than Richard I's ransom. But can Scotland afford a ransom of 1 million gold coins? What's more, there are thousands of prisoners of war. Although the number of prisoners of war has not been counted, Edward estimated that it could be exchanged for a ransom of hundreds of thousands of gold coins. Scotland has only 500,000 people, because the country's terrain is rugged and agriculture is not developed. In order to repay the ransom of 150,000 marks, Richard I of England was reduced to taking his army to rob, and died as a result. Therefore, Edward seriously doubted whether the Kingdom of Scotland could come up with 1 million gold coins. Add those prisoners of war, Scotland will definitely not be able to pay the ransom. It is to make them unable to pay, so that you can detain James IV for a long time. If the ransom is not paid, you will not let him go back. In this way, I estimate that it will take many years. And after these years, you will definitely have a firm control over England. At that time, it would be better to send troops to annex Scotland in the name of Scotland's unwillingness to pay the ransom. What a wonderful idea! Edward's eyes lit up immediately. Indeed, he could not kill James IV casually. However, he could demand a huge ransom that Scotland could not afford, so that Scotland could not pay it back. In this way, Edward would have a reason to detain James IV for a long time. In this way, the Kingdom of Scotland would be leaderless for a long time. James IV originally had 2 younger brothers, but both died and left no offspring. In this way, Scotland would be leaderless for a long time. In fact, James IV did not even have any offspring. In this way, as long as the time is right, England can indeed easily annex Scotland. But I can't kill James IV. If he's alive, he's still a threat to my annexation of Scotland. Then let's kill him. We'll first use James IV as a hostage, keep blackmailing the Kingdom of Scotland, and drain the finances of the Kingdom of Scotland so that they have no money to support the army to fight against England. Finally, we'll annex Scotland in the name of the other party not wanting to pay all the ransoms. As for how to deal with James IV, Your Majesty, you can send assassins to lurk in Scotland. After you release James IV back to the country, you can send assassins to kill him halfway. In this way, you can shirk responsibility for things that don't happen in England, and put the blame on James IV's opponents. Assassinating James IV in Scotland? What a good idea. Edward's eyes lit up. James IV has no children, brothers, or nephews. As long as he dies, Scotland will have no legal heirs. By then, it would be even easier for England to send troops to annex Scotland. But Edward thought about it and said, "That's not right. I remember that King James II of Scotland had a younger son named Alexander, who was the Duke of Albany in the Kingdom of Scotland. He had an heir named John, who is the current Duke of Albany. If we killed James IV, wouldn't that just give John, Duke of Albany, the opportunity to inherit the throne? If this guy is still here, my annexation of Scotland will still have an impact." Marin thought about it and said, "This is simple. The assassin you sent to assassinate James IV deliberately left the Duke of Albany's mark at the scene. In this way, when you marched into Scotland, based on this clue, you directly insisted that it was John, Duke of Albany, who sent people to assassinate James IV and usurped the throne. You came to help James IV avenge his death out of justice and executed John, Duke of Albany. By the way, you took over the entire Kingdom of Scotland. Great, really great." Edward gave a thumbs up in admiration. Then, Edward and Marin, the accomplices, had a detailed discussion on the shameless plan of extorting first and then killing the King of Scotland. After the discussion, both of them laughed obscenely. In the camp, a gust of cold wind blew. Chapter 697, Sending Captives to Dig Coal. While Marin and Edward, 2 shady men, were plotting against Scotland, the battle statistics were already out. Quartermaster Wald played a cameo role in the battle statistics. He was from a merchant family and was good at math. Archduke, the battle statistics are out. Wald didn't know English and only knew German, so he could only report to Marin alone. Speak. According to statistics, there were 2,700 casualties among the 10,000 enemy troops. Among them, there were 2,154 wounded and 546 killed on the spot. But among the 2,154 wounded, it is estimated that more than 700 will die from serious injuries. Why is the death rate so high? With our military doctors treating them, there shouldn't be so many deaths, right? Marin was puzzled. Most of the wounded soldiers in his army could be cured. Archduke. It's like this. These difficult-to-cure wounded were basically injured by muskets. The damage caused by lead bullets was too serious, and the military doctors said it was difficult to save them. So that's it. Marin suddenly realized. The injuries of cold weapons are easy to heal, but the 30-gram spherical lead bullets will roll in the human body and cause huge trauma. In severe cases, it will cause a blood hole as big as a bowl, which is very difficult to heal. In addition, lead is poisonous. Being hit by a lead bullet not only causes a large wound, but also is difficult to heal. Therefore, it is indeed difficult to save people who are shot. In addition, there are 7,300 healthy captives. Among them, 465 are nobles. This is the situation on the side of the battle camp. On the side of the healing militia camp, there are a total of 7,000 militias, all surrendered, and there are no casualties. Wald continued to report. Are all 465 nobles not injured? No, there are 326 injured, basically the group of knights who fled with James IV. In addition, 52 nobles died in battle, which are not counted in these 465 people. Knights are also nobles, but they are the lowest level nobles. Marin suddenly realized that it seems that nobles are still afraid of death. Moreover, there is a rule in Europe that nobles are allowed to be redeemed, so in critical situations, nobles generally choose to surrender to save their lives. Only a small number of nobles were unlucky and were killed before the overall situation was settled. Are the 326 injured knights counted among the 2,700 casualties? Marin asked. Yes, Grand Duke. That means there are 139 nobles who were not injured, including James IV. That's right. So, among the healthy captives, 7,161 are not nobles. Grand Duke, you are really good at math, and you can do it in your head, which is amazing. Unlike my subordinates, I have to do pen and paper calculations to figure it out. Walder flattered. Okay, I'm not showing off my math, I just want to say that those 7,161 healthy non-noble Scottish prisoners of war should be sent to Newcastle coal mine to dig coal. Digging coal? Walder was a little stunned. He couldn't keep up with Marin's thinking rhythm. Nonsense, with so many prisoners of war, daily food consumption is a big problem. Instead of feeding them for nothing, it is better to drive them to the coal mine to dig coal. It just so happens that the coal mine has been shut down for a while because of the invasion of the Scots. Let's take these people to dig coal to make up for the losses in the past period of time. Marin waved his hand impatiently. Now the coal for burning in the mainland is supplied by the Newcastle coal mine. Because of the suspension of work in the war some time ago, the mainland is expected to have a short-term coal supply difficulty. Then, how to arrange the Newcastle miners hired before? The same coal mining. However, the two groups of people are separated. These Scottish prisoners of war, arrange them to dig coal in the mines with dangerous terrain around them and not easy to escape. However, they must be shackled. Understood. Grand Duke Marin, what are you talking about? Edward did not understand German and did not know what Marin was talking about. Your Majesty, I am arranging the prisoners of war. Marin turned his head and said with a smile. Prisoners of war. How did you arrange them? To dig coal. There are many coal mines in Newcastle, so it's just right to arrange those uninjured prisoners to dig coal. But it's not good for you to decide the arrangement of prisoners of war alone. Edward was a little dissatisfied with Marin for deciding the arrangement of prisoners of war without discussing it with him. Your Majesty, there are more than 7,000 prisoners of war. I don't object if you want. But can you afford the rations for more than 7,000 strong men? Marin asked back. This. Edward was speechless. He was a poor guy. If Marin and the French hadn't helped to advance a lot of capital, he would not be able to get up at all. Speaking of food, his own food was provided by Marin. So, I let those 7,000 prisoners of war mine in Newcastle, and I provide food, isn't that good? Edward thought about it and nodded, but then asked. Are there any nobles among these 7,000 prisoners of war? It is very bad manners to let nobles mine coal. No, we will take the nobles with us to the south. Those who stay in Newcastle to mine coal are all civilian Scottish soldiers. That's good, but aren't you afraid that these Scottish soldiers will riot? They are capable of fighting. It's okay, I will put shackles on them. In addition, I will let 5,000 people from Sivag's 5th Legion stay to supervise these prisoners of war to mine coal. At the same time, guard against people from Scotland coming to rob people. That's good. Edward nodded, but still a little regretful. Because he originally planned to win over Sivag for his own use. But the North does have to guard against the Scottish attack again. After all although these 10,000 people are the main force of Scotland, there are still some old, weak, sick and disabled second and third line troops in Scotland. If they attack and no one defends, these prisoners might be snatched back, allowing Scotland to restore its military strength. Therefore, it is necessary to leave people to defend. As for the arrangement of the remaining 7,000 Scottish militiamen, Marin and Edward disagreed again. Edward believed that these 7,000 militiamen were relatively honest and could be used as coolies to help transport supplies south. But Marin objected. Marin's reason was that 15,000 English militiamen and about 14,000 English prisoners of war had been captured before. In addition, Marin's army itself brought more than 10,000 militiamen, all of whom were staying in Grimsby at the moment. If these 7,000 Scottish militiamen were taken south, the army's food supply would become extremely difficult. But in Newcastle, won't the food supply be equally difficult? Edward asked back. No, Your Majesty, Newcastle is a port. I can transport food from Emden. It is very convenient to transport. But if we take these militiamen on the road, we need to transport food by land, which is very troublesome. These militiamen don't need to do anything else, just transport food. Edward thought about it and agreed to keep these 7,000 Scottish militiamen in Newcastle temporarily. Then, Marin felt that he couldn't just treat these militiamen as masters, they had to work. So, these 7,000 Scottish militiamen also became coal miners. Of course, because they were more honest and had no combat power, they didn't need to be shackled. Sivag, who came to Marin to receive the order, was shocked and said, "Oh my God, this time there are more than 14,000 young laborers for coal mining. How much coal can we dig out? However, my current task seems to be to make shackles for the more than 7,000 prisoners of war first. In addition, I have to order the coal mining shovels needed by more than 14,000 people. Are you stupid? Who told you to send more than 14,000 people to dig coal? And more than 14,000 shovels? Shouldn't the coal be transported to the dock for loading? Let all the prisoners of war go to dig coal. As for the militiamen, you can arrange 2,000 to 3,000 people to transport the mined coal to the dock with carts for loading. Understood, I'll arrange it. Right away." Just like that, more than 10,000 laborers poured into the coal mine in Newcastle, and the mining speed of the coal mine soared greatly. As for whether these unfortunate Scottish prisoners would die in the explosion of gas underground, that was not what Marin cared about. Anyway, there were no Scottish nobles in it, so they could be killed in the explosion, and there was no need to pay compensation. That's how it was in this era, only nobles had human rights. Chapter 698 Henry VII's Countermeasures. After Marin arranged the Scottish prisoners of war, the army finally had time to go south. This time, Marin decided to go south by boat. Newcastle was originally an inland port, and the Tyne River was full of docks. The fleet that had previously carried the army to Ashington also entered the Tyne River and arrived at the docks of Newcastle. At this time, all they had to do was load the army again and transport it to the port of Grimsby at the mouth of the Humber. Soon, Marin and Edward followed the army and went south by boat. Of course, there were also hundreds of captured Scottish nobles. They were all precious meat tickets, so it was safer to bring them with them. When the north was in chaos, London was not idle either. Henry VII and a group of his men were discussing countermeasures. The news of the defeat in the north had been reported back to London. Henry VII was so angry that he vomited blood that day, and then he regretted replacing the experienced Richard Bohr with the inexperienced Henry Percy. But the big mistake had been made, and it was useless to regret it now. Henry VII was also a very courageous man. He was not afraid of being slapped in the face. He invited back Richard Pole, who was sent to negotiate with the French, and asked him to help find a way to deal with the crisis. For Henry VII and his men, it was now a life-and-death stage. If they failed completely, the consequences would be disastrous. You know, Edward's banner was to punish the regicide. Who was the regicide? The first offender was naturally Henry VII, but Thomas Stanley, Earl of Derbyshire, John de Wheeler, Earl of Oxford and others would never be pardoned. Because it was because of their betrayal on the battlefield that the York family was defeated and lost to Henry VII. As important accomplices of the regicide, their only fate was to be hanged. As for Sir Richard Pole, Richard Fox, Bishop of Winchester, Baron John Dingham, Thomas Howard, the second Duke of Norfolk, and Johnson, the Minister of the Navy, although they did not directly participate in the Battle of Bosworth, they were the confidants of Henry VII. If Edward won and ascended the throne, they would not have a good ending. The best result would probably be expulsion. If they were unlucky, they would be hanged with the previous big guys. So, in order not to lose their wealth and even more afraid of being hanged, these people had to unite and fight hard. After all, it's not the end of the road yet. Tell me, where did this bastard Marin Hoffman come from? Why did he help Edward, the rebel? Henry VII said angrily. Everyone looked at me, and I looked at you, and no one stood up to speak. In fact, Marin is a German, how could these English people know? Only Richard Bull cleared his throat and said, Your Majesty, I know this Marin. He is from the county of Mark in the German region. He was originally just a wandering knight without the right of inheritance. However, he almost captured Charles VIII by ambushing the army of King Charles VIII of France at night in Fornovo, Italy. Since then, he has become famous and became a celebrity in the Holy Roman Empire. He was also granted the title of nobility. Later, he seized the county of East Frisia and became the Count of East Frisia. As a capable general under Henry VII, Richard Bull had naturally heard of the reputation of Marin, who was very capable in fighting, and had also roughly studied Marin phalanx, so when talking about Marin, he naturally talked endlessly. Seize the county of East Frisia. The German region is so chaotic, the county can be seized at will. And become a count. Without noble blood, can you easily usurp the throne? Henry VII felt unbelievable. No, although Marin Hoffman's father was just an ordinary knight, his mother was a descendant of the Bloch family, the rulers of the East Frisian county decades ago. The Bloch family was replaced by the Saxony family after a rebellion. Therefore, Marin Hoffman's seizure of the East Frisian county, strictly speaking, was to take back the family's territory in revenge. Okay, I don't care about his legal status. I just want to ask, what is his military ability? Very strong. Last year, he led 40,000 troops and defeated the 50,000 soldiers coalition of the electorate of Brandenburg and the electorate of Saxony. More importantly, among the 50,000 coalition forces, 20,000 are powerful Swiss mercenaries. Richard Bull said seriously. Hiss. Everyone took a breath of cold air. Everyone knows how powerful the Swiss mercenaries are. In recent years, the French have brought a large number of Swiss mercenaries to cooperate with the French heavy cavalry in every war. This combination is quite powerful. At least, England can't beat it. However, Marin defeated the 50,000 enemy troops with 20,000 Swiss mercenaries with 40,000 men. How strong was he? No wonder the Earl of Northumberland lost. He turned out to be such a tough guy. Richard Fox, Bishop of Winchester, sighed. He was not worried that he would be finished. After all, he was a member of the church. Edward won. At most, he would lose power, but not his life. No, the reason why Henry Percy was defeated seems to be that he was attacked at night by that guy. Henry VII learned this detail from his intelligence personnel. And this detail was found out by the scouts under Henry VII who sneaked into the vicinity of York. Night attack. Oh, yes, this guy is really good at night attack. He used night attack to defeat King Charles VIII of France. Richard Bull said. We are not afraid of night attack. We can send people to guard day and night. But the problem now is that we are seriously short of soldiers and it is difficult to defend London. Thomas Stanley sighed. So, how many troops does the other side have? Richard Bull asked. During this period, he was sent to Calais to negotiate with the French, and knew very little about the domestic intelligence. According to the report of his men, he has about 20,000 men. As for Edward's 10,000 men, it seems that the French have taken away their 7,000 French soldiers by ship. Henry VII said. In fact, the French deliberately revealed this information to Henry VII to give him confidence. The French soldiers left. What's going on? Richard Bull became interested. Moreover, this is also good news for them. It seems that according to the information revealed by the French, the Scots sent 10,000 troops from the north to attack, and they also had a conflict with Edward the rebel. The French wanted to sit on the mountain and watch the fight between the tigers, so they withdrew their 7,000 men, wanting to watch Edward and James IV fight each other. This is the information Henry VII got from the French. What Scottish invasion? Richard Bull was shocked at first, but soon said. That's great, it would be great for us if these two forces fight each other. But our military strength is really limited. Even though Edward and Marin Hoffman's army suffered heavy losses after the conflict with the Scots, we are still no match. There are only more than 3,000 veterans in London now. And if we train new soldiers, I'm afraid we won't have enough time. Henry VII said frustratedly. But Richard Bull thought for a while and said. No, Your Majesty, we still have troops, but no one has noticed it. Troops? Where are they? Henry VII asked in confusion. Your Majesty, have you forgotten what kind of country we are in England? A maritime country. We are on the sea, with many warships. You mean? Henry VII seemed to have grasped something. Yes, we can recruit those sailors. They are used to fighting on the sea, and many of them are brutal pirates. But, those people are fierce in combat on the ship, but they may not be as good on land. Navy Minister Johnson questioned. As the Navy Minister, Johnson knew very well that these people were very powerful on the swaying deck of the ship, but they were not so fierce on the shore. You are right, Lord Johnson. If they were in the wild, these sailors might not be able to beat ordinary regular infantry. But we don't want those sailors to fight the enemy in the wild. Right now, what we need is to defend the city of London. Those sailors have good swordsmanship, which may not be good for field battles, but they can still be used to guard the tall and solid city walls. After all, they have rich experience in fighting. Richard Bull said confidently. These days, he took a ship to Calais to negotiate with the French, and naturally saw many fierce sailors and knew their tempers. It seems, it makes sense. Henry VII's eyes suddenly lit up. It is undeniable that the English sailors who are good at fighting on the deck are good at fighting. Although they are not very suitable for fighting on land, Henry VII does not need them to fight with others in the wild. It is not a big problem for them to guard the city head with the tall and solid London city walls to block the enemy. Moreover, because of their excellent fighting skills, their ability to defend the city is definitely much stronger than those temporarily recruited civilians. So, Henry VII immediately gave an order with full confidence all the English sailors who know how to fight should go ashore, and then, with sailors' scimitars, report to the London recruiting office. There are at least 10,000 or 20,000 sailors who are good at fighting in England. If they are all recruited to defend London, facing more than 20,000 people on the other side, Henry VII feels that he is very confident in defending. After hearing this plan, the ministers under Henry VII also gained confidence. As long as London is defended, there is still hope for a comeback. At worst, we could just train a group of new soldiers. So, while recruiting English sailors, Henry VII also ordered the urgent recruitment of a group of strong men in several counties in southeast England for training to fight against Edward's upcoming army. Chapter 699, The Enemy at the Gate. Henry VII's plan to recruit sailors to join the war was not implemented very smoothly, because the plan was implemented too late. Richard Bull was previously sent to the Calais fortress to negotiate with the French to discuss the issue of exchanging prisoners of war for the Calais fortress. But Louis XII was not stupid. He would rather pay a ransom than hand over the Calais fortress. Therefore, Richard Bull was dragged in the Calais fortress for a long time, and he came back to offer this strategy, which was naturally much later than Marin expected. It was precisely because of this time difference that the attitudes of many big ship owners and sailors of the Five Ports Alliance began to become ambiguous. It is true that these ship owners know that if all the experienced sailors of the Five Ports Alliance help to defend London, they may be able to save London and the Stuart dynasty. However, that would cost a great price. What's more serious is that Marin threatened in a secret letter written in the name of Edward to those big ship owners if the old sailors of the Five Ports Alliance all went to London to help, the army might not be able to capture London, but it would be no problem to run to the seaside and take down the 5 port cities. Moreover, if they were angered, it was not impossible to massacre the 5 port cities. This threat really frightened the big ship owners, who were all wealthy and powerful, and their foundations were all in the 5 port cities. If they risked their lives to help Henry VII defend London, the 5 port cities would be empty immediately. At that time, it was inevitable that they would be conquered by Edward's army. If the other side really massacred the city, those big ship owners didn't dare to gamble. Anyway, even if London was defended, Henry VII might not win. Because those sailors were not used to land battles. It was okay to rely on tall city walls to fight a city defense war, but they would definitely be abused on the plains. Therefore, even if Edward couldn't conquer London, he could occupy other areas outside London, including the 5 port cities. If Edward besieged London for a long time, Henry VII would eventually be defeated. Thinking of this, those big ship owners sent their confidants to several military ports on the Irish coast, secretly notifying those sailors and even captains, asking them to find a way to shirk Henry VII's call. As for the excuse, it seems that Kidd's fleet is still wandering around this generation, and they can leave in the name of chasing enemy ships. Then, before Henry VII's order arrived at the western military port, these ships prepared enough food and fresh water and went out to sea to hunt down Kidd's fleet. This time, these large ships from the 5 Ports Alliance decided that they would not come back for 2 months. Hearing that the fleets in the west went out to sea, Henry VII was also helpless. So, he had to recruit ordinary sailors outside the 5 Ports Alliance. There are also many people with rich sailing and combat experience among these sailors, but the scale is completely incomparable to the 5 Ports Alliance. Therefore, before Marin's army arrived, Henry VII recruited 10,000 sailors from nearby ports. In addition, 5,000 farmers were mobilized from several surrounding counties to assist in defending the city. Counting the previous 3,000 regular troops, there were 18,000 armed forces in London at this time. This does not include the London citizens who serve the army. But in fact, most of this army's combat effectiveness is not very good. If it were on the plains, it would be defeated in 1 round. Fortunately, the city of London is very tall and strong, and with its tall and strong walls, they can hold on for a while. As for Marin, after the army re-embarked in Newcastle, it arrived at the port of Grimsby at the mouth of the Humber River a few days later. Then, the army landed and joined the small number of troops and civilians who stayed behind. At this time, according to Marin's order, the Duchy of the North Sea transported a large amount of food from Emden to the mainland and stored it here. After 2 days of repairing the army, Marin gathered the army again and marched south to London. In order to speed up, Marin left most of the captured British soldiers in the port of Grimsby and specially built a large number of concentration camps to accommodate them. At the same time, together with the Scottish nobles, they were also placed here. As for the defense of the port of Grimsby, Marin handed it over to the navy of the Duchy of the North Sea. The fleet of the Duchy of the North Sea stationed in the port of Grimsby has 10 500-ton warships and 10 250-class armed merchant ships. The total number of sailors on these warships is as high as more than 4,000. Marin asked them to arrange half of them to land and guard the prisoners. The rest stayed on the ship. Because of the lack of people, Marin also sent a fleet back to the country to send more people to avoid the loss of the prisoners. Among them, the most precious are naturally the Scottish noble prisoners such as James IV. These people can be exchanged for a large amount of ransom, which is very valuable. If they were placed in a place close to Scotland like Newcastle, the Scots might try their best to rob people. But if they were placed in Grimsby Port, there would be no problem. With so many powerful warships and the Humber River blocking them, it would be difficult for the Scots to succeed even if they fought hard. After placing the prisoners, Marin directly led the main force, 15,000 civilians, and the same number of civilians as the British Army to the south. There are more than 30,000 civilians transporting food and supplies, so don't be too easy during the march. Whether it was transporting food and grass, artillery ammunition, or tent fences for camping, it became very easy with so many civilians. By the end of August, the army had passed through Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire and Essex, and arrived near London. When passing through Cambridgeshire, Marin also commanded the army to plunder the almost undefended capital of Cambridgeshire, Cambridge City, but spared Cambridge University. Marin even suggested to Edward that he recruit a group of law students who were about to graduate from Cambridge University to help him govern the country in the future. After all, this time to overthrow Henry VII, a group of senior officials needed to be killed, and there would definitely be many vacancies for officials. Instead of promoting those unreliable middle and lower-level officials who were originally attached to Henry VII, it would be better to train a group of college students from Cambridge University. Of course, it is necessary to identify clearly whether there are any noble children of Henry VII among these people. By August 30th, Marin's army had officially arrived outside the city of London and began to set up camp. The city of London is located on the north side of the Thames, so if you want to attack the city, you can only attack from the east, north and west. Therefore, Marin set up 3 camps in these 3 directions. Although this dispersed the troops, Marin gave Henry VII 10 courages, and Henry VII would not dare to attack out of the city. Because there were only 3,000 regular troops in London at this time. The rest were either pirate sailors or civilians. If they came out, they would definitely be sent out. In fact, Marin had asked the people of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce to focus on raiding the West Gate of London. However, in order to confuse Henry VII, Marin deliberately placed the most important artillery unit for the siege in the north of the city. This makes it seem as if the main attack direction is the north of the city. But in fact, Marin had already prepared to attack the West Gate. However, before the siege, Marin had one more thing to do: subscribe to the channel. Chapter 700, Betrayal of Princess Margaret. What is Marin going to do? Naturally, he is going to kill Edward's sister, Princess Margaret. This woman is too tough and scheming. If she is still there after Edward successfully seizes the throne, Marin dare not guarantee that he can take over England smoothly. You know, Marin's strategy is to use the marriage of little Caesar and little Princess Margaret to unite the Kingdom of England. However, if Princess Margaret is there, it's hard to say. This woman might interfere. After all, she is Edward's sister and an absolute local snake. If she opposes the union, it will be difficult to handle. For example, Edward III should have become the King of France according to his bloodline. However, the French nobles were not willing to let the King of England become the King of France at the same time, so they united against Edward III and supported Philip VI, a branch of the royal family, to become the King of France, triggering the 100 Years' War between England and France, that lasted for 100 years. Therefore, this stumbling block must be removed by Marin. However, Marin can't kill her by himself. After all, that is Edward's sister. If he did it himself, he would inevitably turn against Edward. By then, the marriage between little Caesar and little Princess Margaret would no longer exist, and the union would become a luxury. Therefore, Marin chose to borrow Henry VII's knife to kill Princess Margaret. For this, Marin prepared for a long time. According to the agreement between Marin's people and Princess Margaret, the people of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce and Princess Margaret would open the city gates in 2 directions in the middle of the night. Among them, Princess Margaret was responsible for sending people to open the East Gate. The people of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce were responsible for opening the West Gate. Of course, in order to facilitate future activities, the people of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce deliberately said that they were short of manpower, hid most of the manpower, and borrowed a group of people from Princess Margaret to seize the West Gate together. For this reason, the people of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce specially bought a small yard near the West Gate of London early, and started digging a large basement early to hide more than 100 people and weapons and armor. Similarly, Princess Margaret, who was in charge of the East Gate, followed suit and bought a small courtyard near the East Gate. She also secretly dug a huge basement, which also hid more than 100 people. However, in order to pit Princess Margaret, the time for opening the city gate agreed by Marin and the 2 parties was inconsistent. The agreement with Princess Margaret was to open the East Gate at midnight on the 2nd day after the army besieged the city. The order given to the people of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce was at midnight on the 3rd day after the army besieged the city. As for why there was a 1-day interval, it was naturally to expose Princess Margaret in advance. Of course, in order to confuse those who borrowed from Princess Margaret, the group of people near the West Gate would also go out once at midnight on the 2nd day. However, the person in charge of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce, who was in charge, would deliberately delay. When the city was panicking about arresting Princess Margaret's East Gate troops, he would deliberately retreat. Then, wait until the next day to start again. On the first day of the army's arrival, Marin's army was busy building the camp, and ignored the nervous enemy on the top of the city. Because there were 30,000 civilians, Marin's 20,000 soldiers did not help build the camp, but were on guard against the enemy in London. The first day was peaceful. Early in the morning of the 2nd day, Marin ordered someone to bring out the artillery, and used 50 infantry guns to bombard the North Gate of London. Henry VII was so scared that he sent people to block the North Gate, and it was blocked with bricks. In this way, even if the North Gate was damaged by artillery, it would be fine. But on the afternoon of the 2nd day, someone suddenly came to the palace and claimed to inform. This person was called Weber, the shopkeeper of a grain store under Princess Margaret, and one of the important members of Princess Margaret's intelligence network. The intelligence he brought was also very shocking: someone was going to cooperate with the enemy to open the East Gate. Henry VII was immediately furious and ordered Weber to be brought into the palace, questioning. Who is going to open the east gate to welcome the rebels into the city? Weber looked around fearfully and said. It's my master, Margaret, Countess of Salisbury. Richard Bohl, who was listening, was so shocked that the precious blue and white porcelain water cup in his hand fell to the ground and broke. Do you know what you are talking about? It is a capital crime to frame a noble. Richard Bohl said seriously. Although Princess Margaret was not from Henry VII's faction, she was his wife after all. If his wife had rebellion, he would also be implicated. Weber looked at Richard Bohl and seemed very scared. Henry VII suppressed his anger and said gently. Tell me what you know. There must be evidence. I have evidence. What evidence? At midnight tonight, Margaret's men will force a sneak attack from the inside of the East Gate, open the East Gate, and let the enemy enter the city. What? Say it again. Henry VII stood up in shock. Weber seemed to be frightened by Henry VII's reaction, but he still said. I will never lie. Whether it is true or not, we will see tonight. After a pause, Weber said. In addition, according to what I know, the rebellious Edward was replaced by a young man with a terminal illness who looks very similar to him, who was sent by the Countess of Salisbury. This is definitely a super explosive news. Henry VII has never understood how Edward escaped. Now, the truth is revealed. Asshole. It turns out that this bitch is responsible. Henry VII smashed a whole set of Oriental porcelain in a rage, obviously furious. You know, after Edward escaped from the Tower of London, with the support of the French and Marin, he posed a great threat to Henry VII. Now, the enemy has destroyed the regular army of the Kingdom of England and directly surrounded the city of London. If he loses this time, Henry VII may die and his clan will be destroyed. Therefore, the man who rescued Edward from the Tower of London must have been hated by Henry VII. Richard Bohl was so frightened that he dared not breathe, but out of luck, he still asked. How did she get Edward out? Weber replied. The Countess of Salisbury first seduced Auxiliary Bishop Frith with her sex appeal, and then took advantage of Auxiliary Bishop Frith to enter the Tower of London to give Edward a chance to pray, and brought in Bert, a country boy who looked exactly like Edward. Then, taking this opportunity, Bert and Edward exchanged clothes, and finally brought Edward out of the Tower of London. Afterwards, Countess Margaret immediately sent someone to kill Auxiliary Bishop Frith to silence him. In fact, this answer was 70% true and 30% false. Most of the content was true, but Weber made changes to how to use Auxiliary Bishop Frith. Of course, this was instructed by Marin. Yes, Weber was Marin's man. But after Princess Margaret began to secretly build her own power, Marin arranged Weber to be Princess Margaret's subordinate and became her right-hand man. Of course, Princess Margaret herself didn't know. Originally, Weber's mission was just to help Marin monitor Princess Margaret. But now, Marin directly asked him to stand up and testify against Princess Margaret. After listening to Weber's confession, Henry VII and Richard Bohl were very angry. Henry VII was angry because Princess Margaret rescued his greatest enemy Edward, which led to a series of bad things. Richard Bohl was angry because he was cheated on. Didn't Weber say that Princess Margaret deliberately seduced the other party in order to use the Auxiliary Bishop of Frith? What did she do after seducing him? Naturally, she cheated on Sir Richard Bohl. For a medieval knight who valued honor very much, this was too embarrassing.